Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Unslaved. Happy to be back with you once again. And today we're going to be talking about the question of questions. Who are you really? The who am I? Where have I been going? What's it all about? These are the deep questions. And so, very much looking forward to this, diving into Michael's new book, getting into existentialism and so much more. So, good to see you as always, Michael. And where to begin with this one?
Oh, yeah. It's just one chapter that is from the book, and it's actually not even that necessarily about existentialism. It's more about philosophy in general, but it's very pertinent to the book because I wrote this book for beginners, people who are absolutely, not like you, me, or, friends of ours. This would be a real kickoff point. So it's written in very simple language, but it covers a lot of scope. And this chapter is one of those that is more general, broad, broad picture. And yet at the same time, it's because it's a theme that existentialists have dealt with, I think, better than anybody else. And that's the self, the nature of the self. And we learned in previous podcasts and in other articles I've done that in existentialism, there's a difference between the subject and the self in a technical way that's not used normally. Like when we say subjectivity or subjectivism, that's perfectly, the dictionary definition is about one's own inner being. But there was a slight change in existentialism that might shock people when you're reading. That's why they throw the books across the room and go, I don't know, what are these guys talking about? It's because there's this famous split between subject and self, so that existentialists could talk about the self with a small s, the subject as it is more of a construct of society. And this was important distinction. And they reserved the term self then for the sort of capitalized true self that we would recognize as the true self. So you can still use the word subject for self in general usage, but sometimes in existentialism, they split it just so that you know there's a pseudo self. Now, this would be picked up in psychology in the same way, but they would use the term ego or persona or even idealized image. These are three famous terms that are used in psychology for the same thing, to try and stand for this counterfeit self. And this counterfeit self faces the world. It's very useful as well. There's nothing you really can do about it. I mean, it's a construct, and it's a construct that's only to a small degree a matter of will. It's something that's sort of forced upon a child when they're young. And then you act in the world as if you are that ego or that self or that persona or that idealized image. So this is one way where existential psychology, existential philosophy nicely dovetails with conventional psychology, in the Jungian and Freudian sense, that there is this mask or persona, and it has its own life. It's really this kind of a stitched up thing. And in the more extreme renditions of existentialism, like certain movies or whatever, this is a very sort of falsely portrayed character, a character with no essential life, one who goes along to get along, one who always obeys the rules. But of course, that person is steaming within. That brings us to the next point. Steaming within with what? Steaming, well, we've covered that before as well as a key existential theme, the difference between shame and guilt. We'll look at my article and maybe you can read some of it, and this will come up again, the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt being the more commonly known syndrome in which the part of us called the superego, again, a sort of section of the ego, floods us with guilt if we're not conforming to society. That's what it's for. And it's one of the most powerful parts of the psyche. You keep hearing people talk about the psyche, and yet they clearly show that they know really very little about it. And as an adjunct to the superego is this thing called the image ideal. Very important as well, because that's where the heroes and anti-heroes, reside. We don't have time to talk about that now. So the ego, the superego, and the ego ideal are a triad of the ego complex. The ego would run wild of its own. It would be feral. It would be feral and somewhat amoral. Not immoral, but sort of amoral, just like a child is. Remember we talked a few weeks ago about the dark roots of anxiety and delayed gratification. Well, the ego is sort of an unbounded wild child. And so in order to keep it trained, you get the superego. And the superego is the one that molds it, but it does it with a sort of a jackboot. It does it with a clipboard. It does it with this hectoring voice, which is embodiment of the parents and embodiment of society, of your teachers and everything else. So you get flooded with guilt. Can you believe it? It's called the guilt complex. The guilt complex exists when your own mind floods you with guilt. So when you look at the highest levels of stress in our world and the high levels of medication taking and alcoholism and addiction to sweets and things like that, lots of syndromes come from this. It's to try and bring sweetness into your life, but also to kind of anesthetize this guilt. But the guilt wouldn't be there, say the existentialists, if you were a classic outsider. If you just stood up for yourself and spoke your mind and told people where to get off and did not compromise in who you were, you didn't violate their boundaries, but you spoke as your true self. You didn't cultivate this mask. You would be the levels of guilt might go up, but this other thing we talked about, shame, goes down. Now, what is the shame? The shame, well, when you're conforming and doing what society wants, the guilt is reduced, so you feel happy, right? You feel that things are moving along just fine. But then at 35 years old, you find yourself lying on a psychiatrist's bench where everything isn't fine. Telling your doctor, doctor, I'd be just fine if it wasn't for reality. I mean, help. It's because in the middle of all of that reduced guilt, there's this countervailing shame that comes about for your conformity. So the article goes into this a bit. And this is an existential theme. It's also a very common psychological theme, because the psychologist, if you go to see one, he's got to decide, he's got to find out, especially an existentialist one, they're going to have to decide, where are you at? Are we treating guilt or are we treating shame? There's a big, big difference. If you're treating guilt, well, that's more like a car wash. That's that person looking to be, as Arno Gruen said, readjusted to an abnormal world. And Krishnamurti has said this as well. Oh, that's a totally different type of therapist and different kind of therapy. If it's the shame, there's a possibility then that person might only feel better when you now have got into the existential issues and you have addressed this conformity head on. And now there can be real change. And only that, when the person is not conforming, not just going along to get along, does the shame reduce. You see, and so this is where you're caught. So in life, why there's so high levels of stress is because it's going to be one or the other. Man is not free. He's a crucified being. He's either going to feel the guilt for not conforming to society, and the guilt goads him to conform. He has to be the organization man, or he stops doing that, or he continues doing that. And while he continues doing that to become effective and superior and what he thinks is happy, there's this weird underlying ghost of shame. that starts to haunt him as well. So he's never free. Now, the existentialist would say, and it's a damn good thing that there is this shame. We've tried to bring this out time and time again. Because if there wasn't this emotion, this mood of shame, have you any idea what people would be like? We give people way too much credit. The amount of conformity we see, and this zombification, and this docility, and this apathy, and this go along to get along is minor compared to what it would be if people had a choice. It is only this countervailing weight of existential shame that stops us even being even more Orwellian, more ingrained with the status quo. That's how bad it is. It's the only thing that reins us back. And even then, it doesn't do it very much to most people. They still can live for decades with this shame and just learn how to, mollify it, how to suppress it. Now, we need to know this because this is affecting us. It affects people around us. We've got to know ourselves whether somebody is being plagued with guilt for not conforming, and all of their syndromes and complexes and issues are based in, people don't like me. They're not giving me the approval on tap. Or it's a deeper mood of uncanniness that the more you try to conform, something inside you rebels and pulls you more towards authenticity. And we struggle against it. So authenticity definitely exists. It's just that we tend to struggle against it because we want to lower the guilt. So the person who then is existentially authentic can handle the guilt. He learns to say, really, I'm not fussed about how people treat me and whether they like me or they don't, and whether I get those, 3 stripes of approval or I don't. Now that is very easy to say. It's very, very, very hard for most people to do this. In fact, their whole training of life, their whole acculturation goes against it, actually. So these are the big themes that mattered and that are dealt with again in this particular chapter, right? But it's also deals with, well, in opening, let's go to that first slide, Immanuel Kant, because it's important to know where to start with these subjects so people have a nice orientation. Do you have the Kant one?
Oh, it should be up now, yeah.
Yeah, but there was one of his birth date before there? No?
This is the first one. Let me see.
The second one? You're in the wrong order? Okay. Go back. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, I guess it's just the one there, yeah.
Oh, is it? Okay. Yeah, transcendental idealism. Then let's go back to that. So this is his term. Oh, we had a program once before about not mistaking the terms transcendent and transcendental. If people remember that.
Right, yeah.
It was just a detail, because transcendental is a very different word than transcendent. It was Kant's specific term for capacities of the mind that enable us to know reality, the external reality. And know is very much in inverted commas, right? They're transcendental, these capacities, because they're not themselves learned from the world. This was a big, big revolution. In fact, it was called the Second Copernican Revolution. Mostly it was in philosophy, of course. The first Copernican revolution was a scientific thing, when Copernicus discovered that the planets move around the sun and all that. Well, this revolution that Kant had made in terms of philosophy was likened to that. But what it amounted to was, when you break it down, was that we need these innate capacities, like you need spectacles in order to see the world. And without them, there's no world to even see. So what it really meant is that we don't have access